Üçüncü konuğum, ismini telaffuz etmek biraz zor. Sayın Nejc Jus. Nejc Jus. Bize bir sunum yapacak. Söylediğim gibi bu WTTC dediğimiz konseyin, Dünya Turizm Konseyi'nin araştırma direktörüdür. Nejc Jus. Araştırma da bu konsey için çok önemli bir başlık. Yani aslında faaliyetlerinin merkezinde araştırma işleri bulunuyor. Turizm sektörüne de bu şekilde yön vermiş oluyorlar aslında. Yani tüm dünyada turizmcilerin hem devlet otoritesinin hem de bağımsız kuruluşların ve sektörün baktığı bir kuruluş. Onun için zannediyorum bizimle çok kıymetli veriler paylaşacak. Şimdi sözü ben kendisine bırakıyorum. E, so I just finished for you. Please go on.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here in Istanbul today at the Economy Summit, and thank you so much for the invite. Today, I will be talking to you about Turkey in a global context, looking at travel and tourism's, WTTC's travel and tourism's economic data, as well as its environmental and social indicators. For those of you who are not familiar with WTTC, we are a membership-based organization. Our members are the CEOs and chairs of the world's leading travel and tourism companies. We span across all geographies of the world, and we cover all industries as well, including hotels, airlines, airports, travel agencies, tour operators, and so on. And we have a number of Turkish members as well, which we are very proud of. Now, first, looking at, I have some slides. I'm not sure if they're showing.
You can see over there.
Okay, I thought they were showing here as well.
Just over there.
Okay.
You can follow over there.
Okay, I thought they were showing here.
It's
somewhere.
over there.
Oh, they are. Great, sorry. First, I will be looking at the global economy. 2024 first was a record-breaking year for the sector. Here I'm looking at 4 different indicators. First one is looking at travel and tourism's contribution to GDP. Here we're looking at sector's direct impact, indirect impact through the supply chain, as well as its induced impact. We are also looking at travel and tourism's jobs, as well as international and domestic spending. Firstly, looking at contribution to GDP, our sector was supporting $10.9 trillion of global economy in 2024. That's 10%. $1 in $10 came from our sector last year, which is a very significant number. Similarly, sector jobs accounted for 10.6% of overall global employment, just under 360 million jobs. We saw strong annual growth across all 4 indicators, as well as strong growth compared to the pre-pandemic levels, with an exception of international spending, which was still slightly below the 2019 level. Now, looking into the future, we're also projecting with our forecasts, 2025 is set to be another record-breaking year for the sector, with all indicators increasing further on the annual basis, and also international spending is set to exceed the pre-pandemic levels for the very first time. We're also projecting 10 years into the future, and the future looks bright. Travel and tourism's contribution to GDP is set to rise on average at about 3.5% each year until 2035, exceeding the overall economy growth for the total of $16.5 trillion. Looking at jobs, our sector is set to support 462 million jobs by 2035. It is also set to create 91 million jobs, new jobs, which is 1 in 3 of all new jobs on the planet. So here you can see a summary of the trends I mentioned with a few more. In fact, travel and tourism was the fastest growing economic sector worldwide last year, and it is set to remain the fastest growing sector next year. When we look at regional performance, all regions already exceeded the pre-pandemic levels last year, with the strongest performance seen in the Caribbean and the Middle East. This year, Asia Pacific is set to become the fastest growing region. However, not everything is as rosy as it seems. There are challenges, in particular when it comes to labor and skills. And we recently launched the report looking at the future of work in travel and tourism, looking at challenges and opportunities for the decade ahead. But first, some of the context. COVID-19, the pandemic, was devastating for our sector. 70 million travel and tourism jobs were lost in 2020 alone. This led to staff shortages in the post-pandemic period when travel and tourism businesses were ready to hire again. And even now, with the employment levels more or less back to the pre-pandemic levels, many travel and tourism businesses are struggling to fill vacancies. For example, in hospitality, we are seeing a shortage of housekeeping staff as well as chefs. Another challenge, which is more specific to higher income economies, is that aging and declining working age population is having a negative impact on the labor supply. Also, globally, as I mentioned already, tourism growth is outstripping the overall economy and the available labor supply. And then we also have a fast rise of technology, including the AI. And our survey shows that digital literacy is a key skill for employees to possess in the future in order to thrive. As part of our research, we also looked at labor demand and supply projections for 10 years ahead, trying to determine the gap between demand and supply. And our results are alarming. We expect 43 million vacancies by 2035, which represents a 16% gap between demand and supply. And 20 million of these 43 million will be for lower skilled positions. Again, some of the key factors behind this trend is that declining working age population is having a negative impact on the available labor supply, as well as travel and tourism growth is outstripping the overall economy. However, these are also some of the opportunities. In order to seize these opportunities, we have to attract more youth into the sector. We have to provide leadership opportunities in order to retain labor, but also we have to bridge the gap between academia and private sector. In addition to our economic impact reporting, over the last few years, we started reporting on sectors' environmental and social impacts. We're looking at indicators on the environmental and climate front, such as greenhouse gas emissions from the sector. We're looking at water use and footprint. We're looking at energy use and source, as well as air pollution and resource input. On the social side, we are segmenting employment by age, wage, and gender. All these indicators are aligned with Sustainable Development Goals. And what this data helps us to do, it helps us to determine the status quo, and it helps to determine where the policy action is needed the most. And now some of the results when it comes to environmental footprint, looking at carbon emissions from the sector. There is some good news here. Last year, in 2024, our sector was responsible for 7.3% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, which is down from the levels seen in 2019. Another good news is that whilst travel and tourism GDP grew by 6% compared with 2019 levels, greenhouse gas emissions were down by 9%. In other words, we are seeing decoupling in the sector. Sector's economic growth is being decoupled from its environmental footprint, which again is a shift in the right direction. But more needs to be done in order to reach net zero and other climate goals. We also saw a rise in low carbon energy use by 16%, but again, this is not enough to reach our climate goals and more needs to be done. Our data also helps us to determine which industries are contributing the most to global greenhouse gas emissions. Here you can see, unsurprisingly, transportation was a number one source. 40% of all emissions in the sector came from transportation. This includes not only international aviation, but also transportation within the supply chain, domestic aviation, road transport, and rail transport as well. Second key source was utilities. And this calls for some policy action. We have to scale up the production of sustainable aviation fuels, for instance, and we have to make our grids greener. Our sector contributes positively to social impact worldwide, and our data supports this. Looking at youth employment sector, youth employment in travel and tourism has a higher share than the overall economy, which means we are providing opportunities for younger generations. Looking at female employment, we saw the share in both travel and tourism and overall economy being broadly similar in 2024. We also contribute $3.5 trillion to taxes globally, which is 1/10 of all global government revenues. And these revenues not only support travel and tourism, but also broader economy by contributing positively to infrastructure projects and healthcare, for instance. And now just looking at some of the figures for Turkey. Here I'm comparing performance in Turkey with Europe. You can see $1.4 billion was the contribution of travel and tourism to Turkish economy in 2024. The share of just under 12%, which was a higher share than for Europe overall. We also saw a strong rise when it comes to the comparison with 2019 levels. 36% higher was for Turkey in 2024 than in 2019. When we look into the future, 2025, we see across Europe as well as for Turkey a strong annual rise as well as the rise compared with the 2019 levels. When we look at contribution to jobs, similarly, 3.2 million jobs were supported in Turkey by travel and tourism, which is just under 10% of all countries' employment, broadly similar to the European average as well. And when we look at the forecasts are positive. Again, we are seeing a positive growth this year for both Turkey and Europe as well. International spending is key for economies globally, and in particular for Southern European economies. Here you can see share of spending that comes from international tourists for a number of countries, as well as for the world and Europe, as well as how international spending compares with 2019. You can see here for a number of Southern European economies, including for Turkey, we are seeing a stronger reliance on international spending than for the world overall. Also, we are seeing a strong recovery when it comes to the 2019 levels. Now, looking into the future, again, the story is positive. We are seeing a strong 2.9% rise each year average until 2035, which is set to be above the overall economy growth for Turkey for the total of $214 billion. Similarly, when it comes to jobs, we expect 500,000 of new jobs to be generated by our sector in this country for the total of 3.8 million jobs. Earlier, I talked about staff shortages. And as you saw, we are expecting to see significant staff shortages at the global level, but also for all economies that we analyzed. You can see here China, India, and the EU are set to have the largest shortages in our sector by 2035, which is unsurprising given the size of the economy as well as their significant workforce. Here you can see also Turkey is set to have a shortage of around 330,000 workers over the next decade, which is a very significant number, unless action is taken. When we look at the relative terms, we see different countries on the top of the rankings. We see Japan, Greece, and Germany having the largest relative shortages. But also, again, all countries are set to see relative shortages, including Turkey, where 9% of its demand is set to be unmet by 2035. Now, looking at economic impact versus its environmental impact, I already mentioned the decoupling story on one of my earlier slides, which means that travel and tourism in environmental emissions are growing at a slower pace than the travel and tourism economy, which is a movement in the right direction. And this also holds true for a number of economies in Southern Europe, for the majority, including for Turkey as well. So we are seeing, again, travel and tourism emissions are growing or even declining, whilst travel and tourism GDP has been increasing over the last few years. But we have to start reducing absolute emissions. This is the key in order to reach climate and net zero goals. And last but not least, looking at social impact, in Turkey, we are seeing a stronger rise of female employment and youth employment in travel and tourism than in the overall economy, which again is good news for the sector. And when it comes to tax contribution, our sector is contributing $42 billion in this country, 10% of all government revenues. And these government revenues from our sector are used to support infrastructure projects, healthcare, and other public services, which is benefiting broader economy as well, not just our sector. And just to wrap up, our sector is a global powerhouse for growth. It supports millions of livelihoods across the world. However, there are challenges, including workforce challenges. We're seeing overcrowding in certain destinations, climate challenges, environmental pressures. However, with the right forward planning and by investing in people, skills, technology, nature preservation, climate action, we can ensure that our sector remains resilient and future ready.
Şimdi şöyle bir soru sormak istiyorum. Politik soru sormamam için söz verdim size. Politika ile ilgili değil. Şunu soracağım. Akdeniz'deki ülkeler açısından, Türkiye'yi de içine koyduğunuzda turizm açısından gördüğünüz en önemli risk, en önemli meydan okuma nedir? Ya da iki tanesi nedir? Ne görüyorsunuz? Şahsi fikrinizi merak ederim.
Sure. So I already mentioned workforce challenges. We are seeing this across all countries and economies that we analyzed. So it's staff shortages across all different skill levels, low skills, higher skills. But also we have to attract more youth into the workforce, into travel and tourism workforce, and we have to retain them. So for that to happen, we need to have strong leadership programs, we need to have government support and many other measures. So that's one key challenge for the sector. Otherwise, we won't be able to achieve this growth. So that is my one point. The second one, we are seeing overcrowding, pressure on destinations, particularly in peak summer months for many Mediterranean destinations. And we recently launched a paper, a call to action for the private sector on how to overcome this challenge. And key here is that it's not just tourism specific issues. It's not just a tourism specific issue, but it is also a combination of poor governance as well as many other factors.
Okay, thank you. Evet, umuyoruz pahalı oyuncaklarınızın teslimatı da gecikmez fazla. Çünkü büyük şeyler bunlar. Daha da başarılı olursun inşallah. Şimdi sevgili Nejc, bir sorum daha olacak sana. Turizm sektöründe önümüzdeki 10 yıl içinde en hızlı büyüme beklediğiniz alan neresi? Nereye görüyorsunuz? Yani şimdi belki burada yatırımcılar var, iş adamları falan, para sahibi insanlar yani. Nereye yatırsınlar paralarını? Havayolu işi pahalı bir iş. O biraz büyük bir şey. Ama genel anlamda ulaştırma diyebiliriz. Efendim otelcilik diyebiliriz. Dijital endüstriler diyebiliriz. Ya da sizin sık sık temas ettiğiniz işte inclusion, kapsamayı içeren alanlar olabilir. Neyi görüyorsunuz siz? Hangi alan daha cazip olacak bu 10 yıl içinde?
Sure. So all areas are interconnected. So if you invest in one area, then you have to also invest in another area. If you invest in infrastructure, you have to make sure that you have enough hotels, that you have labor and skills available. So investment in labor and skills, but then also you have to think about connectivity and new routes as well. So I think all these areas are interconnected. A very good thing is that people are after experiences. So travel and tourism is an experience. So we are on a positive future pathway. I think one of the segments of travel and tourism that is rising fast is wellness as well as luxury experiences as well. However, luxury is being redefined. It's more about authentic luxury experiences. So I would say wellness, luxury, but also all different segments, which includes hotels, aviation, connectivity, because they do go hand in hand. And now going back to the overcrowding problem, one of the reasons is that there is underinvestment in infrastructure. So there has to be a balance between demand and supply.